Thank you. Good morning.
Right, Mr. Tully. Before I move on, I understand that overnight you refreshed your memory about 3 incidents about which I asked you yesterday, and they are the incidents I was asking you about where we saw the use of the word snitch or grass, as the case may be, one involving a colleague, Dan Lake, the other Gary Groucher, and another Ginge.
Yes, sir.
Having refreshed your memory, what can you tell us then, very briefly, about the Dan Lake incident? And I'm not going to take us to the transcripts. We looked at them yesterday to save time, but what do you remember?
DCO Lake was talking about a new member of staff that he'd been talking to, and the new member of staff was telling him that on their training course they were encouraged to report any poor behaviour by staff, which Lake referred to as grassing or snitching. But he said that the new member of staff was reassuring Lake that he was not a snitch and he would never snitch unless it would directly put his job at risk. And so, I mean, really, the conversation that Lake was telling me about just showed the culture of snitching in the centre, and how quickly the culture around snitching or raising concerns in the centre, and how quickly new staff got wind of that, and their efforts to assimilate.
Yeah. So that was Dan Lake. The other one we'll remember, I think the first of the 3 which I asked you about yesterday was the Ginge one, relating to Babs, who we thought was Babatunde.
Yes, sir.
Tell us about that. What do you remember about that one now?
So having rewatched the footage and sort of understanding a bit more about the context, Ginge was telling me that Babs had been abused racially by a detainee, and that he was abusive back towards the detainee in some form or another, that detainee made a complaint, and the inference that I got from staff, from Ginge, was that that complaint had been corroborated by a member of staff, because I suggested to Ginge that a member of staff would not be suspended on the word of a detainee, and there seemed to be some agreement there, and some comments from Ginge and another DCO, whose name I can't remember, around no one likes a snitch. So it was not far from what we saw yesterday on the transcript, but given I didn't know much about it, it was hard to confirm what it was about, but that's what it was about.
And finally, the Groucher transcript, we'll remember, was that about a detained man grassing a member of staff?
Yes, so that was as shown in the transcripts. Grouch was informing me about DCOs falling asleep on constant supervisions during night shifts, and that greater care should be shown because detainees snitch on staff as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Right, back to your witness statement, please, and I have it open at page 47, paragraph 188, and I want to ask you, please, some more about healthcare, ACDT, and adults at risk policies, which we've not yet mentioned. First of all, what level of insight did you have into the operation of healthcare at Brook House?
Obviously, I didn't work in healthcare, sir, so it was limited. My understanding of healthcare is that they were understaffed. I had no knowledge if they were contractually understaffed, but they simply did not have the staff members to meet the needs of the detainees, particularly given how many medical responses there would often be due to instances of drug misuse or self-harm. So I knew the healthcare department to be overworked, understaffed, stretched. Detainees were often very frustrated with healthcare. Sometimes they would complain about not getting their medication. And I had a lot of sympathy for the healthcare staff because there were so few of them, and they had to see to the needs of over 400 detainees.
Were you aware of any psychological support for detained men?
I was never really aware of this, to be honest. Maybe that because I didn't work in healthcare, that I was just simply unaware of it, and that it may have existed, but it wasn't visible. And if we had concerns about the mental health of a detainee, there wasn't sort of a sort of mental health specialist or a way of raising concerns about the mental health of detainees.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of any sort of mental health provisions that were made for detainees. So.
Did you understand anything about an adults at risk policy that operated at Brook House?
This policy rings a bell, but I can't recall much information about it.
You trained on it? Were you trained on it?
Possible, probable that we were trained on it, but just given the passage of time, I've sort of forgotten about it.
You mentioned before the ACDT form that would be completed when you were supervising somebody on E-Wing. And this was just an ordinary document which set out time, date, and you completed observations.
Yeah, so it was an orange booklet, and if anyone could open one, any member of staff. So I think I recall opening some. I opened one. I remember one detainee telling me that he was feeling particularly low, and I opened up an ACDT. I think you to my recollection, you write the detainee's name in. You write in why you've opened out the ACDT, and then you advise a manager, probably the Oscar one. Such a long time ago since I opened one myself, but they were forms which were used to monitor detainees that staff were aware were at risk of sort of self-harm or suicide.
And the discretion was entirely yours. So even a DCO could make the decision whether or not to open an ACDT form.
Yes, sir.
And if you didn't want to, you wouldn't do it.
Yes, sir. Or if you simply didn't believe the detainee, you're under no obligation to.
Yeah.
Unless it was sort of an explicit.
Unless
it was an explicit. The detainee had told you that he was going to harm himself or that he was going to take his own life. I mean, besides that, I don't think there was any sort of obligation to open an ACDT if you didn't want to, or if you didn't believe the detainee's mental health deterioration to be sincere.
Did you ever have any disagreements with anybody else about whether such a form should be opened as regards a particular detained man?
Well, whenever I opened an ACDT, so I never consulted anybody else. I just did it. So I was never told not to open an ACDT. Equally, no one ever came to me and asked me, this detainee said this. I don't want to open an ACDT. What do you think?
Yeah. And how does it work? I mean, let's just think for a moment. You've been on the wing, and a particular detained man has told you he's in low mood, or he feels that he might self-harm, or he's depressed, or any such other sentiment is expressed to you, and you decide to open an ACDT form. How do you know an ACDT form doesn't already exist in relation to that man?
In the DCM's Oscar 1 office, there's a notice board with a list of every detainee that's on an ACDT.
Yeah.
So I think if you wanted to open an ACDT, you would sort of go and get one and fill it out, and then you take it to the Oscar One office. Maybe they'd have to sign it or something. You'd certainly need to inform the manager at some point, because it would need to be monitored not just by you, but the wing officers, the DCMs. And so if you went to the wing office and if you went to the DCM office to ask to let them know, then it would become apparent to you if that detainee was already on an ACDT.
And if that detained man was already on ACDT, would you be opening a new form?
No, sir, but you would make an observation in the ACDT that already existed. So if I wanted to open an ACDT about a detainee who told me he felt like he was going to self-harm, and I found out that the detainee was already on an ACDT, I would write an observation in his ACDT myself, whether it was being stored in the wing office or wherever else, and I would write that in the observations.
Right. So in an ideal world, there shouldn't be more than one form open for any one detained man?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
Right. How are they closed?
An assessment by a DCM.
Right. And what kind of assessment would that be?
Conversation, a chat. I sat in on a couple of these conversations. Sometimes I think it was good practice for DCMs to have someone else who was witness to the conversation, so they couldn't be seen to be closing it unjustifiably or continuing it without reason either. And the DCM would ask them how they're feeling. Do they feel like they want to self-harm or hurt themselves? Are you feeling an improvement in your health? Are you eating more? How's your case going? Those kinds of questions. If at the end of that conversation the DCM felt that the detainee was no longer at sufficient risk of self-harm or suicide, then he'd be taken off the ACDT. There were instances when a detainee, for example, I can recall one detainee who was on hunger strike for quite a long time, and he did begin to eat eventually, but the DCM didn't want to take it upon himself to take him off the ACDT, so there was consultation with healthcare in that instance, and so I think there were times when healthcare would be consulted about whether or not a detainee should continue on an ACDT.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask. What was the threshold for getting healthcare involved in what could be a significant decision in the life of a man who's being detained, who may tell you something which provokes you to open a form, but is perhaps not telling you the whole story?
It's hard to say, sir. It's up to the DCM.
Yeah.
Sometimes SMT members would conduct sort of a review of some of the more high-profile detainees on ACDTs, perhaps those that had spent time on constant supervision or sort of prolific self-harmers.
Yeah.
So it wasn't always and only a DCM, and it wasn't always and only their decision to take a detainee off an ACDT.
Yeah.
But from my experience, it was most often left to a DCM, who wasn't particularly qualified to assess the mental health of a detainee.
It all sounds a bit subjective, doesn't it?
Requires judgment, sir, on the part of whoever's assessing the detainee.
Yeah, but it's subjective judgment which could be proved wrong.
Yes, sir.
Once the form was opened, did that also mean that person went to E-Wing?
Not always, sir, no.
Right. Once opened, did it mean that person had to be constantly supervised?
Not always, sir, no.
So in the instance of a man who did not find himself on E-Wing, for example, somebody who was threatening to commit suicide and might be placed on E-Wing for constant supervision, how does the ACDT form help the man in respect of whom it's opened on an ordinary residential wing?
So, if you were to open up an ACDT and alert the DCM that a detainee had told you something like, I'm feeling so low, I don't think there's any point anymore, life's becoming too much to bear, That's not a statement that says I will kill myself or I will harm myself, but it's an indication of how low they're feeling. So you may open up an ACDT and inform the Oscar 1, the DCM, about those comments. But that's what you would do. You would need to do as part of opening up an ACDT, or some member of the senior management team. And then it was the decision of either the DCM or someone in the senior management team to decide how often they needed to be observed. So would they need to go on a constant supervision, or would they just need 2 hourly, 3 hourly, 4 hourly observations? And
off E-wing, you mean on the ordinary?
On the ordinary wing, sir. Yes. Yeah. So you might have sort of 5 or 6 or 7 ACDTs on D-wing, for example, and the detainees maybe on hourly obs or 2 hourly obs, and which would require a member of staff to go and find the detainee somewhere in the detention centre and write down what they were doing at that time.
Yeah.
You'd have to do it every hour, every 2 hours, or every 3 hours, or 4 hours, depending on the risk that was the risk assessment.
And when in circumstances where you tell us that it was an ordinary situation where there was understaffing, how were officers to cope on the wing if there were, let's say, 2 men running a wing during the course of a shift when there were 6 or 7 ACDTs open?
Even if there were 3 DCOs on the wing, it's an insufficient number. And if there's even 3 or 4 ACDTs, if you've got 4 ACDTs or 3 ACDTs on a wing, and you've got 3 members of staff working on the wing, and they're 2 hourly obs, the obs can't be all at the same time, because that would take all of the members of staff away from their duties. So they'd have to be at sort of intervals. But you can't have staff running around just filling out ACDT forms. So either the ACDT form wouldn't be seen to and an observation wouldn't be made correctly, or the DCO would have to neglect another area of their role, like seeing to the needs of the other 100 detainees on the wing.
Yeah.
So 3 members of staff, I understand that I understand that contractually G4S were required to have 2 or 3 members of staff on a wing, and often there was 2 members of staff. So I mean, technically, contractually, I understand that it was a sufficient number, but in reality, it was a completely insufficient number, because it was putting people at serious risk of harm.
Yeah. As I've said more than once, we'll come on to individual incidents a little later, and from paragraph 190 to paragraph 202 of your inquiry statement, you deal with specific incidents, and as I said, for various reasons, I'll deal with them towards the end. But in general terms, I'd like you please to look at your paragraph 202. A little earlier, you say that you felt it was irresponsible and dangerous to house the most vulnerable detainees on E-wing, along with some of the most difficult and non-compliant detainees.
So,
what kind of men were you talking about in saying that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I should say that you can be vulnerable and challenging, and so that causes some difficulty. But to put it in the most simple terms, if a detainee was particularly violent and non-compliant, perhaps he attacked another detainee or attacked a member of staff, had a mental health problem which meant he was unpredictable and irrational and erratic, he would be kept on E-wing because he wouldn't be able to leave the wing, and in theory was easier to manage. But then the most vulnerable detainees, for example, I remember there was a detainee who was suspected of being under 18. He's actually included in the Panorama film.
Is he the one with the baseball cap, who was
Yes,
thought to be about 14.
Yes, he says he was 14, and staff believed he was under 18 as well.
Yeah.
He was kept on E-wing. And you're down there with some of the toughest people in the prison.
Yeah.
Some of the most violent, and some of the most disturbed. I mean, as a 14-year-old, to be kept in the madhouse where people are going crazy, and you've got people on constant supervisions trying to harm themselves or take their own lives. I mean, it's no place for someone. Well, it's no place for anyone, but it's certainly no place for someone that needs kind of more care. I mean, you think someone's under 18, so you put them on E-wing. I mean, what? You think someone's 18, you get them out of the detention centre,
Yeah.
And it should have been the same for other people who are equally as vulnerable.
While I have it in mind, and you come to this later, but perhaps now is as good a time as any to ask you about this, and I can point you to the paragraph number if you need it in your statement. But in terms of mixing, here we're talking about perhaps just one small part of Brook House E-wing, about the mixing of different kinds of people with different issues. Do you have a view about mixing detained men who had no previous experience of prison, were of good character, but for one reason or another found themselves in Brook House, looking to be removed from the country, and those men who were time-served foreign national offenders? What was your view about that particular mix of men in Brook House?
My view is that it was irresponsible and dangerous. And although most foreign national offenders behaved just as well as those without criminal backgrounds, there was a minority of foreign national offenders that brought with them to Brook House a prison-like mentality, did bring with them criminal behaviour that continued into their time at Brook House. And that rubbed off on detainees without criminal backgrounds, and took focus away from those detainees as efforts and time were exhausted on those that were creating problems. And I didn't think it was healthy at all.
Yeah. Were they better, if you like, at playing the system?
Yes, they were. They were better at playing the system. That's true. They were used to the environs of a prison, so they were able to survive better. And sometimes foreign national offenders would exploit those without criminal backgrounds or those who were more vulnerable. Again, taking you back to the 18-year-old, he was used as a before he was moved onto E-wing, he was used as a drugs guinea pig by his cellmate.
What do you mean as a drugs guinea pig? And we'll come across that idea with one of the other detained men, 1275. But what do you mean?
To test spice on.
So how does that work? Why does somebody need to be used to test spice on?
To see how the batch of spice that had been smuggled into the prison would affect an inmate.
Right. And was that just rumour, or was it known to happen? Did it come from him?
I was told by staff. I was told by Gary Grouch from the E-wing office. I think my notes and my video diaries will indicate that I was also told by another member of staff. But I was certainly told it by at least one DCO. And I mean the mixing of certain people with certain foreign national offenders with people without criminal backgrounds, I also thought was just completely irresponsible as well. For that kind of of that kind of thing.
All right. Let me move on then, please. I think I've already touched on Rule 35 in the past, but let me ask you this. How much did you understand, apart from your training, but when you were on the job, about the application of Rule 35 and Rule 40 and Rule 42?
Can't remember much about Rule 35, sir, but I think I might be getting this the wrong way around. But I think Rule 40 meant you were removed from association, placed onto E-wing, but not placed in solitary confinement. And my understanding was that Rule 42, this is to the best of my memory, meant you would be placed in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Well,
Who made those decisions?
DCMs and members of the senior management team.
Based on what? Somebody's behaviour?
Yes, sir.
And when somebody was placed on Rule 40 or 42, did you as a DCO come to learn why that person had been so placed? In other words, did you understand what the underlying rationale was for it?
Not always, sir.
Would it have helped if you had been told, do you think?
Yes, sir.
Because
you knew sort of you might be able to offer better care for the detainee if you understand if he's down there because of a mental health problem, if you understand because he's down there because of vulnerabilities.
and down there refers to what? E-wing?
E-wing, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. All right. Let's move away from that then, please, and ask you about use of force. And you deal with these in two paragraphs, paragraph 204 and 205. You were involved yourself in uses of force. We see that on the programme and in some of the footage. What's the difference between unplanned use of force and a planned use of force?
An unplanned use of force or a spontaneous use of force would arise if you witness a detainee self-harming or trying to take their own life, or if you witnessed a fight on the wing, or if you were attacked by a detainee. So they were instances essentially when the use of force was, the necessity for use of force was immediate, and that you did not have time to get kitted up into riot gear to engage in the use of force. But it was always preferred if there was time to get kitted up, because this was safer for staff and for the detainee.
Yeah. So,
or at least seemed to be the case.
So typically, as distinct from unplanned or spontaneous uses of force, typically when would a planned use of force take place?
If a detainee was refusing to be transferred or removed or deported, if a detainee was refusing to leave his cell to return to go to the solitary confinement block, if a detainee was refusing to return to their cell at the end of an association period,
that sort of circumstance, I suppose.
Well, you could essentially any scenario in which you can plan the use of force,
Yeah.
in which the use of force doesn't need to happen immediately on the spot.
And who would sanction planned use of force? At what level did it have to be sanctioned?
At least at Oscar 1 level, sir, probably senior management team.
And who briefed the person who was to give authority?
It would depend, sir. Staff would, if a DCO complained about that he was attacked by a detainee in his cell, then it would be on his word that the detainee would most likely be moved down to solitary confinement. If a detainee was refusing to be removed or deported, then whoever that detainee had the conversation with. But I mean, SMT or DCMs would usually try and talk the detainee round before a planned use of force.
Right.
And that's why planned uses of force were more preferable than unplanned ones, because you could offer the detainee multiple opportunities to comply before force was applied, whereas a spontaneous use of force didn't really allow for that.
In that instance of de-escalation, if you like, before a planned use of force had to be used, would the person speaking to the detained man tell him, if you don't, we'll have to use force? Would he be warned about that?
Yes, sir. And if there was a planned use of force and you had to get kitted up and go to a detainee cell, the detainee would be given, you know, it wasn't like a DCM would just fling open the door and then the people in riot gear would storm in and restrain him.
Yeah.
You'd give him the opportunity. You'd stand at the cell door. You'd have an officer at the front of the door with the riot shield. Then you'd have the 3 officers behind, and then the DCM would give him one last opportunity to comply. And quite often, when the detainees were faced with 3 people in riot gear with a riot shield, they would then comply. If they didn't, then they'd be restrained.
And coming back to the briefing of the person who sanctioned the planned use of force, in your experience, if you have experience of it, was it done verbally or in writing?
I don't really have experience of that, sir.
And the person who gave authority, sanctioned the use of force, did that go down in writing, the rationale underlying it, or did that all get written up later in a use of force form?
It's hard to say, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't meant to have been sanctioned and given authority in writing before.
Before. All right. We'll see what the document showed later. In terms of unplanned use of force, coming back to those spontaneous instances, were there circumstances where a DCM was asked to sanction even fast-moving incidents before any form of use of force was used, or by definition, because they were fast-moving and spontaneous, was no sanction required?
Well, at times you couldn't.
Yeah.
You couldn't. You know, if you're attacked or you see a detainee self-harming,
Yeah. You've got no time.
You've got no time to go and ask a
Right.
DCM if you can use force. It's imperative that you do, especially when, you know, around the preservation of life. But I think it was always preferred that a DCM, it's always preferred that a more senior person would sanction a use of force.
All right. Let's now ask you to talk us through a planned use of force.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The authority's been given,
Sir.
and you're on the team. What happens? Where does it all start? Do you get a briefing? Where do you kit up? What do you kit up into? And just talk us through a typical planned use of force, step by step.
Well, as a DCO, you get a call on your radio, and someone would say, "Callum, go and collect your kit from the store cupboard."
Yeah. Right, pause there. What's the kit?
You'd make your way to the store cupboard, and the kit would be a riot helmet.
Right, and that's
Sort of a
we've seen them in the footage.
big helmet with a visor.
And they've got a neck guard.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and temple guards presumably.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Overalls, flame retardant overalls, which would cover the entirety of your body. Flame retardant gloves, arm pads, knee pads, steel capped boots. If you were allocated as the shield officer, then you would pick up a riot shield.
Were you ever a shield officer?
Yes, sir.
And so was that all part of the training we were asking you about yesterday,
Yes, sir.
or the day before, whenever it was now? So all that time ago, you'd had shield training, and were you retrained in it during any refresher course?
Yes, sir.
How to use it properly?
Yes, sir.
Right. So you've got helmet, the overalls, flame retardant overalls, flame retardant gloves, knee protectors. Did you say elbow protectors?
Yes, sir.
Steel capped boots. What
Yes, sir.
else?
I think those were the only things you had to wear. You could also, there were balaclavas.
Why would balaclavas be required?
Well, so the detainee didn't know who you were.
Yeah. Were they ever used?
Yes, sir.
Right.
I used one myself once.
Because?
there was a detainee who was a detainee who I had a good relationship with, and we trained in the gym. And he was seen just as British as you and me, and I think he was second generation Windrush. Grew up in London, ended up getting into gangs, and he was never sort of sorted out with the correct documentation. So he ended up finding himself in a detention centre after his prison sentence. And one day I was called to get kitted up to restrain him. He was being deported back to Jamaica, and I didn't want him to recognise me, because we had a good relationship, and I felt guilt about the restraint, so chose to wear a balaclava.
Okay. Thinking still about the kits, radios?
No, we took those off.
Right. Any other form of object that you could use as a weapon?
No, not that I can remember.
Did any officer ever use a baton or anything like that, or a truncheon or anything like that?
No, sir.
Were they available?
Batons weren't, no.
Anything else that could be used to subdue somebody or to strike them?
Not that I can remember, sir, no.
Well,
I don't think so, no.
I mean, when you say you can't remember, I mean, you surely remember during your 2.5 years.
Yeah, there were no batons, no weapons, no.
Where do you kit up?
In the in the staff room, sir.
And the number of officers involved in a planned use of force, kitting up, would that depend on the circumstances, or was there always a fixed number for the team?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, sir?
Would there always be a fixed number for the team of officers who were going to be involved in the planned use of force, or would it depend on the individual circumstances? How many were involved in the actual use of force going into the cell? I
didn't have much insight into why teams were assembled.
No. Thinking about your own experience, were the numbers always the same, or did they vary? Might there be 5 on one day, 7 on another?
There was usually 4, sir, but
Yeah.
if a detainee had a reputation for being able to kind of overwhelm officers or evade removal, then maybe you would have more than 4 DCOs kitted up.
Yeah. Anyone have handcuffs?
Yes, sir.
Who would have the handcuffs?
The the 4th officer, sir. So you'd have a shield officer. You'd have 2 arm officers, one for the left arm, one for the right arm, and then you'd have a handcuff officer.
So that's the team of 4. So you're saying 1 shield?
Yes, sir.
2 other officers, one to literally take the left arm, the other to take the right?
Sir.
And then the one behind, in a sort of diamond shape, would have the handcuffs. So once the man is subdued, handcuffs are applied.
Sir.
Is that the way it worked?
Sir.
Mr. Tully, would you like to take a 5-minute break?
No, it's okay.
Are you sure?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Chair.
And were there occasions when you would have more than 1 team of 4? In other words, you'd have another team coming in to replace, or on some form of rotation if necessary? I'm simply looking at what you say at the end of your paragraph 205. And let me read it to you. If there was concern that a detainee would overcome 4 officers, additional officers would be allocated to the restraint. In some cases, 2 teams of 4 officers were allocated to the restraint of 1 detainee.
Yes, sir.
If the first team of officers struggled or failed to effectively restrain a detainee for any given reason, then the other 4 officers would take over. The 2 teams would keep rotating until the restraint was complete, or the detainee had evaded removal or deportation, for example.
Yes, sir.
So,
That's correct.
did you have any experience of that? That kind of situation
yes,
where more than one team was required?
Yes, it was rare, but it happened.
Yeah. In what kind of instance did it tend to happen?
As said in the statement, sir, if the detainee was if the restraint was lasting a long time, the detainee, the team of 4 weren't getting anywhere with the detainee, and the officers were becoming tired, then the other DCOs would take over the restraint.
But that would be planned in advance, so you would know what you were dealing with, because
Yes,
you
sir.
couldn't presumably just muster another team of 4.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You'd have a
Spontaneously.
briefing. The assessment would be made on
Yeah.
the detainee's past.
And the briefing would take place, just before you form up and march out, as it were?
Yes, the briefing would take place, in the staff room, sir.
And given by,
DCM or a member of the SMT, sir.
would it be recorded, the briefing?
Yes, sir.
In what form?
With a body-worn camera, sir.
And also go on paper, or would there be a script? We've seen a script for a briefing, certainly in some of the forms, but was that typically done, or was it simply done on a body-worn camera?
I don't know if it was done at the time or if it was transcribed off the back of the body-worn camera
Yeah.
footage.
All right. Well, we'll as I say, we'll certainly, I think, see one script, and if needs be, we can ask you about that. And afterwards, whether it was planned or unplanned, were all staff involved in the use of force obliged to fill out a report, a DCF2, use of form report? Or at least you would provide it.
If you used force, you'd have to fill out a use of force report. Yes, sir.
And different people would contribute to this form. You would fill out your part of a report, which would all go into the overall or overarching report. Is that right? You would say you would set out what you had done and seen.
Yes, sir.
In your section of the report.
Yes, sir.
And other officers involved would contribute to it.
Yes, sir.
And there would be a cover sheet setting out the circumstances. There were tick boxes, and we'll look at 1 or 2 of these forms later as well. All right. You all right, Mr. Tully?
Yes, sir.
You sure?
Yes.
You know you can ask for a break any time you want.
Appreciate it.
All right. Now, I asked you, moving on, I asked you yesterday, and I think possibly the day before, about complaints and raising concerns, and you've given quite a bit of evidence about complaints. One of the things you say in your paragraph 206 is about complaints by detainees. So this is a slightly different topic. That there was a form that detainees could fill out if they had a complaint about something. Were you ever aware yourself of detainees making complaints?
Not about other staff members, sir, particularly.
Yeah. But were you
I mean, they
aware?
made complaints constantly in an unofficial capacity
Yeah, by which you mean?
about the food, about the treatment, about not being released, about
Yeah.
constantly being held there.
Yeah. Can I ask you one other thing about? Do you remember we looked at Rule 45?
Yes, sir, briefly, yeah.
Just need to try and remember where I've stuck it.
I think we looked at it in the undercover operative.
Yeah, can we
protocols.
put up on screen CPS 000025? And if my memory serves me, it's on the first page, on page 1 and 2. Yeah, and if we look at the bottom, we've got general duty of officers. We looked at that yesterday, and if we can just go to the next page, please. At the top. While I have it in mind, and before I forget, one of the sections or paragraphs I didn't take you to yesterday or the day before was subparagraph 4, or paragraph 4. Detainee custody officers shall notify the healthcare team of any concern they have about the physical or mental health of a detainee. Were you alive to that paragraph?
What paragraph is that, sir?
4. Detainee custody officers shall notify the health team of any concern they have about the physical or mental health of a detainee. Is that something that was adhered to by officers, complied with?
Sometimes I'm sure it was, sir. Other
Yeah.
times, I very much doubt it. I mean, even if you wanted to, the healthcare team was so overworked and they were stretched that it was sometimes hard to sort of, they were unapproachable, they were hard to access at times. Sometimes you go to healthcare to speak to someone from the department, a nurse, and there'd be no one there because they'd be responding to incidents, so it wasn't always possible to access someone from the healthcare team. So
Yeah. I've moved away, obviously, from complaints by detainees, but I just wanted to make sure I asked that because we've been asked to ask you that. Moving back to where I was, were you yourself the subject of a complaint?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just tell us briefly what that was about.
I was working in the library, and I was preoccupied with some work, and a detainee tried to take my keys from behind me.
Yeah.
I turned around and told him to get back, to go away. This was on the CCTV footage, which G4S later reviewed, as did Sussex Police after the complaint. What happened was I told the security team that the detainee had tried to take my keys. The detainee was then moved to solitary confinement, or E-wing at least. As a consequence of that, the detainee accused me of assaulting him. But when Sussex Police and G4S came in and reviewed the footage, it was so quickly the allegation was so quickly found to be baseless, that it was very quickly resolved.
Right, moving on from there, disciplinary action against staff. Do you have any direct knowledge of any disciplinary action taken against staff during the relevant period, April through to July in your case?
Besides those that were sacked and suspended as a consequence of the programme, no, sir.
Right. You helped us early on with facilities at Brook House. You remember you told us all about the toilets, your views about the rooms, and the other fixtures and fittings. One thing I haven't asked you, but I will now, is, and you will have had, I'm sure, experience of this, what was the internet like and access to the internet like at Brook House?
It was the internet was a bit of a joke, really, at Brook House. There were a couple of email sites that worked. I think it was Gmail certainly worked. Outlook worked, I think, but I think I've got this the right way around. But I think it was Yahoo Mail that didn't work.
If you're looking for the paragraph, it's 217.
Yes. However, detainees often complained that Yahoo Mail was blocked, and it was a source of frustration for detainees when they couldn't access sites or they couldn't access their emails because, of course, they wanted to work on their immigration cases. I mean, there are often times when the internet failed entirely and detainees couldn't get any work done, regardless of whether they were on Gmail, Yahoo, or Outlook.
What was the problem with the internet? Was it deliberately switched off, or was it just a general failure, or what?
The internet for the staff was fine. You know, it was absolutely fine. You had free access to everything on the staff computers. So I don't know why the internet was so bad for the detainees. I don't know who was behind it. We certainly had no control over it in the IT room.
Is that the only place where they could access
Yes, sir.
the internet? And how many monitors were there?
There was usually about 19 working monitors, maybe 25. I mean, there was about 40 monitors in total, but many of them were broken.
Yeah.
Around half.
And the failure of the internet, access to the internet, was that a regular occurrence?
Well, the difficulty in accessing most of the internet was constant, besides a few websites. The failure of the internet entirely was common, but quite often it didn't completely fail.
Yeah. Were there photocopiers that the men could use? Scanners, fax machines, even?
You could use fax machines freely on your wing.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to scan, I think you had to make an appointment with welfare, which we were in high demand. So scanning wasn't particularly easy at Brook House.
Yeah. And did the men have a credentials, for logging into the system, or was it just an open system that they could use without having to log in? In other words, if they, for example, wanted to email their solicitors, how were they able to do that?
So to access the computers in the IT room, they would enter the IT room. Me or another activities officer would be sat behind a desk. They'd give me their card. I would then allocate them a computer to use if there was one available. I'd unlock the computer from behind my desk, and then they were free to use the computer.
But on what basis, what system were they able to? You mentioned, I think, Outlook a little earlier. Were they given Outlook addresses which they could use?
No, sir. It was on them to create their own email accounts.
So it was up to them how they emailed their solicitors and remained in touch, and whatever system they used, they would log into it, presumably.
Yes, sir.
And use those addresses to communicate.
Yes, sir.
All right. We've mentioned spice from time to time, and you deal with the drugs problem from paragraph 218 onwards, over several paragraphs. During your time there with G4S, what was the availability of drugs like?
The use of drugs was widespread. I mean, it would come in waves. Sometimes it would be more intense than others. But I mean, the prevalence of spice was constant.
Yeah. Was it just spice?
Most often spice, sometimes marijuana.
No. What do you know about spice?
Spice is a kind of synthetic marijuana that, from my observation, doesn't resemble that of someone who smokes marijuana. I mean, it didn't seem to sort of chill people out. It sent people crazy. I mean, people would fit and have seizures and vomit. On occasions, they become violent. The effect that spice really had a big grip on Brook House a lot of the time. It exhausted healthcare. Spice was abused by detainees quite regularly.
Yeah.
It was a real problem in the centre.
You talk about obviously the medical emergencies its use caused, which would have put a strain on the staff, who were already under strain, presumably.
So,
and you recall a particular example of Christmas Day in 2016.
yes, sir.
What was special about that day?
Christmas Day in 2016, there were over 20 medical responses that were called for detainees who had smoked too much spice. I remember early on in the morning watching a detainee on D-Wing just lying in his own vomit. He smoked too much spice and was just been sick everywhere. I mean, it was a absolute chaos. The Christmas Day in 2016. I mean, it was just it's mayhem. You know.
How was it getting in, Mr. Tully?
No idea, sir. I mean, no idea. Never really found out. It was something I tried to sort of explore for Panorama when I was wearing secret cameras, but could never really get anything out of anyone. I think most staff, as far as I was aware, didn't know how it was getting in. I mean, we weren't. I was only searched once in the 2.5 years that I was working at Brook House. And that was on my 3rd day wearing secret cameras, or 2nd day, and so it would have been easy for staff to smuggle drugs in, but I never saw any evidence of that.
Yeah. And you give the example that you've already told us about of the boy who was suspected to be 14 being used as a guinea pig for a much obviously wiser foreign national offender. And you give in your statement, and I'm not going to go through them now, but if anybody's interested, at 223 to 225, some other examples involving other detained men of the use of spice and the outcomes it has.
So.
And you say at 2:30, and this is the last question I'm going to ask you because I think the Chair has some questions for you. You say at paragraph 2:30, on the whole, you feel medical staff did their best in extremely testing and difficult circumstances to respond to the drug misuse in Brook House. And have you ever changed your mind about that they did their best in difficult, challenging circumstances?
I don't think so, sir. I mean, I'm on the whole, I thought healthcare staff did the best they could.
Yeah.
Just from my observations.
All right. Well,
of course.
Carry on. Sorry.
We talk when we talk about the choke on D1527.
Yeah.
We learn that.
Well, we'll come to that later.
Yes.
Yeah. Chair, you've a few questions, I understand.
Thank you. Yeah, can I just clarify with you, Mr. Ortman, first? Are we going to be returning to the issue of spice after we break, or would this be a convenient point to ask a
No,
question on
I've
that?
truncated it. So no, if you have questions, Chair,
Okay.
now's your opportunity.
Mr. Tully, I just wonder if you could answer a question on that specifically for me. Do you remember any training that you underwent regarding submitting SIR, security information reports, in relation to the use of drugs?
Not in relation to the use of drugs, Chair, but if we suspected that drugs were being held by a detainee in a cell or any part of the centre, then we would be required to submit an SIR, Chair.
And the same question, but in relation to any information that you may have had about how drugs were coming in. I think you've probably answered this in your comment to Mr. Altman a few moments ago, but would you have understood that you could submit an SIR if you had information about how drugs may be?
Yes, Chair, definitely.
Okay. Were you ever asked any questions relating to an investigation about drugs? We talked about one instance yesterday. Anything else that you can remember in addition to that?
Not in addition to that, Chair, no.
Okay, thank you. And I also have a question relating to the ACDT process. Did you, from your memory, understand that your role was in relation to carrying out observations on somebody who was on an ACDT? Or did it relate to other activities, such as needing to have certain conversations with them or engage with them?
As a DCO, you were mainly responsible for filling out observations. I think it was on the DCM to have those conversations about how they were doing and whether they were improving or not. I mean, I think your own observations as a DCO would possibly be taken into account by DCMs or members of the SMT when deciding whether or not to take someone off or keep someone on an ACDT. So it's not like you didn't have a bearing on the decision, but it just was never your decision.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question, in relation to wing and cell allocations, Did you ever have any involvement in making decisions about where individual detainees would be placed? Was that done at a DCO level?
That was done at a DCO level. I wasn't a wing officer, so I never had to make those decisions. But DCOs and DCMs would decide which, where detainees what cells detainees would go into when they were admitted to a wing.
Okay. In relation to that, do you ever remember an assessment of any type being conducted in relation to who could safely be kept in a shared space together, the equivalent of like a cell share risk assessment, that kind of documentation?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair, no.
Okay.
I mean, staff, my experience was that most staff would try and keep nationalities together in cells, but any sort of form of assessment to judge the suitability of a detainee being held with another, I wasn't aware of, Chair.
Okay, and one final question, my apologies. We talked about when there's a use of force and it's a planned use of force and that certain equipment and kit is put on, including helmets and overalls. When DCOs and DCMs are walking around the wings ordinarily, my understanding is that they would have a name badge on.
A name badge?
A name badge or something that identifies them to detainees, is that correct?
You would have your G4S pass that you would wear around like a lanyard around your neck with your photo and your name on it, yes, Chair.
Okay. If you were wearing the necessary clothing to conduct a planned use of force, would that be visible?
No, Chair.
So a detainee who was being restrained by a group of officers, would they be able to identify who those officers were unless they happen to know them?
No, Chair.
Visually? Okay.
And of course, the accessibility of balaclavas meant that staff could restrain detainees without being identified in any case. So even if detainees did see through your visor, if you were wearing a balaclava, they wouldn't be able to know who you were. That's obviously, and that's why I'm particularly sort of ashamed of the restraint of the Jamaican detainee, but it's relevant, so I've said it.
Thank you.
Chair, I'm going to ask for a slightly earlier break, if you wouldn't mind today. But there's one further follow-up question, not from anything, Chair, that you've asked, but one thing I wanted to ask you and omitted to. You remember you told us about the boy?
Yes.
And you refer to him at paragraph 222 of your witness statement, where you say on the 12th of May 2017, a male detainee who said he was 14 and who some staff believed was under the age of 18 was placed on E-wing after being observed high on spice. You say you made a note of this on page 15 of one of your notes, BBC 000059. Staff told me they suspected he'd been used as a drugs guinea pig by the detainee he was housed with on A-wing, who was an FNO, a foreign national offender, who had a violent and aggressive nature. And you remember being told that by an A-wing officer and Gary Croucher, who was an E-wing officer, at least at that time. I just want to pick up this, and this is all it is. In the same notebook at page 18, you say, young Pakistani boy later taken away by social services.
Yes, sir.
So it's the same boy who you noted up a couple of pages earlier in your notebook.
Yes,
We
sir.
can see, thank you very much, the line is at the bottom, young Pakistani boy taken away by social services, and was that because of his age?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
I think it's D852 on the cipher.
All right, thank you very much.
Just so you know who
Thank you very
the name,
much.
sir.
Thank you. Well, Chair, as I say, we are slightly early. When we come back from the break, and perhaps we might have 20 minutes today if you think that wise, I'm going to ask you a little about your resignation and things that followed from that, and then we'll come on to some of the incidents.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will return, should we say 11:25?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman. you.
Mr. Tully, you resigned from your position at Brook House, as you told us before, on the 7th of July of 2017, having emailed the company, I think, the day before.
Yes, sir.
And it was agreed that your resignation would be with immediate effect. At the time, was G4S still unaware that you had been working for the BBC?
Yes, sir.
And you told us, obviously, about your time on the training programme with the BBC. I'm not going to go over that again. Afterwards, after the Panorama programme had aired, did you have any contact with former detained men?
Yes, sir.
And you set that out in your statement, and I'm not going to go through it, but if anybody's interested, it's at paragraph 240 and onwards. And certainly there was one individual who we know as D275, who we'll come to, who you went out to Tunisia to visit.
Yes, sir.
And interview.
Yes,
as
sir.
part of the, was that for the programme?
It was, sir, yes.
Can I ask you about staff, looking at your page 64?
Yes, sir.
Was what happened and your part in it, in terms of Panorama, well received by other members of staff at Brook House?
No, sir.
What did you meet by way of response from former staff members or other staff members who were still there?
There were some positive messages on Facebook and Twitter, but the majority were abusive. There was a time, it was around Christmas time, in 2017, 2017, around Christmas, I think. Perhaps 2018, I can't quite remember.
You say in your statement 17.
Yes, sir. I was home visiting family for Christmas, and I was out with friends, and this is about 2 a.m, and bumped into a DCO who chased me. I was chased home, not chased home, but chased down the road, and jumped in a cab and got in a cab home. So, I was met with hostility, as you'd expect,
Yeah.
given the attitudes amongst staff towards whistleblowing or grassing or snitching,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it.
Now, and you name that officer in your statement as Sean Sayers.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And you've also had the occasional catch-up, as you call it, with Nathan Ward, now Reverend Nathan Ward. Who was he?
He was a senior manager at G4S. He worked at Tinsley House and Brook House, and he was someone that had concerns about the abusive culture and the treatment of detainees at Brook House in particular. Someone who did raise his concerns internally. I understand he raised his concerns to Jerry Petherick, the managing director for G4S Custodial Services, more senior than Ben Saunders, who was the centre director at Brook House.
Yeah.
He felt nothing was done. Indeed, nothing was done. So we have kind of, we would talk from time to time and reflect on our experiences, and of course we're both similar in that we were disturbed by the things that we'd seen and feel an element of guilt about our role in the system. And so I take comfort from talking to Nathan, because he's someone who I can empathise with and who empathises with me.
And as you know, he's a witness.
Yes, sir.
In this inquiry, like you, and we'll be hearing from him. You've also made 2 other witness statements. Let's just open them up. which you provided the inquiry as part of your exhibit CT1. Chair, it's in the main bundle for you at flag 3. For you, Mr. Tully, don't bother going to the hard copy. We've got one that's dated the 27th of August, which is at INQ 000051, page 33. And we'll just put that up on screen for a moment, if we may. At page 33. And here's a witness statement. And we can see the header is the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Just to put this in context, this was to do with disciplinary proceedings taken against one of the Brook House nurses, Jo Buss, who we will be thinking about a little in a short while. And this statement we can see is dated the 27th of August 2019. And if we go to page 37 within this document, we see the incident on the 25th of April is really the guts of what this statement was all about, and her part in it. Yeah?
Yes, sir.
And the other statement, which you've supplied to the inquiry, is the one that we find at page 27 of this collection of documents. And we can see it's a witness statement made in judicial review proceedings. One of the claimants there being, you can just make it out, ciphered as 1618, D1618, from whom we hope to be hearing on Thursday afternoon. And in this statement, typically without going through it, you are asked to and did give an account about really the conditions of detention at Brook House. That's really what the thrust of that statement was about, and it's dated the 13th of December 2019. So you made two statements within a matter of months for different reasons in 2019.
Yes, sir.
Right, well, if needs be, we'll come back to them. Thanks, that can be taken down. And you also, for the the sake of completeness, made a witness statement to Sussex Police, and all of this material, Chair, I've asked to be adduced previously, but just so everybody can see it. XXP SXP 000120. Chair, this is in section A, behind divider 1 of your first bundle.
Thank you.
There we have it. It's a statement, thank you, that runs to 9 pages. It's a statement to Sussex Police, who were investigating, in particular, the 25th of April incident. It's dated, as we can see, the 23rd of November. And if we go to page 4, please. Page 4. Oh yeah, sorry. We can see that you, after you go through some introductory matters, you deal with individual incidents, beginning there with the one on the 25th of April. And if we go to the penultimate page, on page 8, you deal with events in May and June and July.
Yes, sir.
And just for the sake of completeness, Mr. Tully, you made a formal second statement. I don't think we really need to put it up, but it is XXP XP 000118. I don't want it put up on screen, but it's a very formal statement setting out some information about original diaries, you'll remember, dated the 24th of March of 2018. Yeah?
So,
Right. Okay. Right. Now, earlier in the course of your inquiry statement, you set out a number of examples of incidents which you highlighted as being evidence of misconduct or the attitudes of staff toward detained men in a series of instances, or the treatment of vulnerable men, in which you provided other examples. I'm going to start, please, by asking you to go back to paragraph 190 of your witness statement, please, at page 48, because I want to ask you about one incident about which you provide quite a lot of information, and you've referred to it in passing from time to time. And
Yes,
it's
sir.
an incident for which we don't have footage, but it's one of the early incidents which you mentioned before you started filming. In fact, long before you started filming, which you introduce as being an example of staff showing little or no regard to issues around self-harm, suicide or mental illness. And you date it the 6th of March of 2016, and you made a note of it in one of your notebooks, which I don't make reference to. What I'd like you to do is, first of all, tell us about the incident itself, if needs be by reference to your witness statement, in as much detail as you can. And I'll stop you from time to time, perhaps, to ask you the odd question.
was working a normal shift, so as far as I can remember, as an activities officer. Because I was sports officer, I had sort of the freedom to move around different parts of the centre. And I went to E-Wing. Immediately I could smell human faeces very, very strongly. It just hit you as soon as you sort of walked onto the wing. I was told by the wing officer, Gary Groucher, that a detainee with known psychiatric problems was locked in cell 2 and had covered his cell in his own excrement. I looked into the cell via the glass viewing panel on the door. The detainee, who I think was from Eritrea, was walking around in circles in the middle of the cell. He'd covered the walls and himself in his excrement. He'd stuck lots of small pieces of paper to the walls with his excrement. His demeanour was non-threatening and his face was expressionless. He didn't respond to anything I was saying. He was just roaming around in circles in the middle of the cell. There were faeces on the floor as well as the wall and bits on the door's viewing panel, which was making it difficult for me to see in. Not long after this, the detainee set off the fire alarm in his cell.
How did he do that?
I'm not quite sure. I think it could be triggered by the kettle at times, or the if smoking a cigarette even. It was quite easy to set off. It was often there were fire was kind of first responses, kind of false alarms, because the fire alarms weren't difficult in the cells, weren't difficult to set off.
And so we're clear, this man wasn't in one of the observation cells, 7 or 8. He was in 2, but
Yes.
on E-wing. So
Yes,
what,
sir.
a much smaller viewing panel?
Much smaller, very, very narrow.
Yeah, right.
But he was also locked behind the door, so he wasn't on the block. He wasn't in solitary confinement, but he was confined to his
Yeah.
cell. Anyway, he sets off the fire alarm, and 2 DCMs arrive: DCM Graham Pennell and DCM Dave Roffey.
And did they arrive in response to the fire alarm sounding?
Yes, sir.
And presumably there was a panel somewhere that would tell them where the fire alarm had gone off?
Yes, sir.
Right.
The detainee, by the time that they had arrived, the detainee had covered the viewing panel with his feces and with excrement, with tissue paper. And so it was impossible to see into the cell. I think DCM Roffey or DCM Pennell sent Gary Groucher around the outside of the detention centre to look into the window to see that it was safe to go in.
Because that was what, on the ground floor?
This was on the ground floor, so
you
yes.
could see that in this instance you were able to see into
Walk
the cell?
around the perimeter road, sir, and look at it from the outside, look
Right.
inside from the outside.
And were the windows, so that we understand, were the windows clear or frosted? Could you see in from the outside?
If you sort of went like that, you could see in, yeah.
Yeah.
He said it was safe to go in, so Roffey or Pennell, I can't remember which one, opened the door, but they opened the cell door and they started making snide comments at the detainee. They started laughing at him.
What? First of all, what state was he in?
He was, if I recall correctly, he was completely naked. At this point, I think he was just kind of shivering on his bed. Yes, the detainee was sat naked on his bed, shivering and covered in his feces. So Roffey and Pennell found it funny. They started making snide comments.
Think of the comments.
Pennell said to him in a sarcastic tone, "Do you want any toilet roll?" He said, "Do you need any toilet roll?" Which he found hilarious, and Roffey found hilarious. It was just treated like we stood there and stared at this detainee as if it was kind of some form of entertainment. And then I think it was Roffey that slammed the door shut. We went into the wing office, which was only a few yards away from cell 2, and they continued laughing about the state of the detainee. Then one of them, I can't remember which, turned off the power in the detainee's cell.
What time of day was this?
This was in the evening, sir.
So, in turning off the power, what did that mean for the detained man in his cell? Was there a light?
Yes, there was a light, sir. Yes.
No, but I mean, once you turn the electricity off, would he have light in his cell, in his room?
I don't think so, sir. There was kind of you might have been able to turn on this kind of there's this kind of built-in lamp into the wall. You maybe would have been able to turn off that, but he wouldn't have been able to use his kettle. I doubt he could have turned on any of his lights, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, there must have been a point, given the circumstances you're telling us about, there must have been a point to them turning the power off to his cell if it was to make a difference.
There was no point.
But you see what I mean? If they were doing it for a reason to make the detained man's life even less comfortable, then it must have had some impact on him. And what I'm asking is, what impact did it have to turn the power off?
Yes, he wouldn't have been able to. Yes, of course. It was more of an inconvenience for him if he needed the electricity. It wasn't there for him to use it. I mean, sometimes it was. I think power would be turned off if a restraint was going to happen in a cell and they didn't want the detainee having access to the kettle or something like that. So I think that's one of the reasons why it was possible to do that.
Yeah.
They found it hilarious that the detainee had no electricity and had been left in such a state. And I mean, he was detainee. He was locked behind a door, was suffering with mental health problems quite clearly, covered in his own faeces. He was naked. He was cold. He was shivering, and it was just an act of.
Yeah.
It was sickening. It still sickens me now, that the act of cruelty. And I just can't. I can't understand why they did it. I just don't what they gained from it. I don't. Never been able to understand what the point was in any of it. They responded to a fire alarm. There was no fire. Could they not have just left it? I don't.
Tell us what Mr. Tully, the position that you told us about and the way that you've left is that this man is still naked, he's still covered in his faeces, the cell is covered in his faeces, the door is locked, the electricity's off, and it's evening time. What became of him? I mean, is the cell left that way? Is he not taken to another cell so that somebody can go in and clean the cell? What happens?
Should have been, sir. Should have been.
Who goes in and cleans the cell in that?
They get these special people to come in overalls, and it's kind of like jet washed. You know.
But did you check on that man later?
I did check on him. I found him in the same state. I recall checking on him that evening and finding him in the same state. Yes,
How long
sir.
after, do you think?
A couple of hours, sir, maybe.
Yeah.
My understanding is an ACDT form was already open on the detainee, so I knew that he was at least being monitored by somebody, so that I knew that others would check on him. For reasons I've spoken about at length, I didn't feel I could raise concerns. I certainly didn't feel like I could write in the ACDT form the extent to which he was abused. I mean, the ACDT form was for writing observations about the detainee's actions, not the actions of staff towards the detainee.
And these two DCMs, Purnell and Roffey.
So,
I mean, you've made clear several times about why it was fruitless to report to a DCM the behaviour of a DCM.
yes, sir.
Were these men in particular popular in any event?
I mean, Graham Purnell was very close friends with Jules Williams, who was a member of the senior management team.
Yeah.
And Jules and Graham would often tell me about nights out they'd been on together. So I knew that they both had good relationships with the senior management team and were well liked. So they would, obviously, if I were to complain higher, then I would never have been believed. And as I say, there was no cameras in the cell, so how could my account have been corroborated?
That wasn't the only incident on the 6th of March. If you go back to your statement of paragraph 184 this time, and here you weren't so much dealing with the treatment of vulnerable detained men, but nonetheless you were dealing with issues of conduct and attitude. Do you see what you say there?
Yes, sir.
And tell us about that incident, because you identify it as being on the very same day as the day you're now describing to us.
Yes, sir.
Tell us about it.
TCO, former policeman called Murphy, I can't remember his first name. Jason Murphy, yeah. Described how during a restraint he was a shield officer, went in to restrain a detainee who had conducted a dirty protest of some sort, which is obviously, for those that don't know, that's covering your cell or yourself in your faeces. And he used the shield to smash the detainee to the back of the cell before pushing his face and body into the detainee's faeces and urine.
Yeah. And that was something you also noted in the same book that you noted
Yes, sir. It
The
was
other accounts
documented,
of
yes, sir.
the 6th of March. Which came first that day? Because it feels rather ironic that you've got Jason Murphy talking to you about what he did during, as you put it, a dirty protest, when the same day you actually witnessed that kind of situation yourself.
Yes, sir. I didn't know if it was the same detainee that I'd witnessed being abused by the two managers, but the reason why I didn't really link them was because DCO Murphy refers to it as a dirty protest.
Yeah.
I mean, it was clear to me anyway, and of course I'm not an expert, but the detainee who I'd witnessed covering himself in his cell in his faeces, he wasn't making any demands. He wasn't visibly protesting. He was just disturbed. He was deeply disturbed. There was something seriously wrong with him.
Yeah.
He couldn't communicate. I don't know if it was because he couldn't speak English, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But there were no demands being made by this detainee.
No.
It wasn't in my eyes a protest. There was something seriously wrong with him, and so I don't know if he was restrained that day by DCO Murphy, and DCO Murphy considered it to be a dirty protest, or if he was referring to another instance. So.
All right. But which came first? What you witnessed with the detained man in cell 2 that day, or Jason Murphy telling you about what he had done in such a situation? Which came first, being told about it by Murphy and then seeing what happened with Ruffy and Pennell, or the other way around?
It was so long ago, I'm sorry, I can't remember, sir,
Right.
but my notes from the time might have times.
All right.
So I can,
Okay, well, we can consider that if necessary. It's not an important thing, but I just wanted to see if you had any recollection of it.
too long to
All
remember
right.
the exact time, sir, I'm sorry. I think the thing that struck me about DCO Murphy was that he was quite new.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I included this particular anecdote in my statement because it showed how a relatively new member of staff had the confidence to tell me that he had abused an inmate.
Yeah.
And
To tell me this, and it's a question that we've been asked to ask on behalf of G4S in relation to this particular incident, the Ruffy Pennell incident. Why didn't you raise a complaint? And I'm sure we know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why didn't you raise a complaint or otherwise report it, for example, in an incident report?
well, I think I've made it quite clear why I didn't feel like I could raise concerns. These were two managers. We were told to raise concerns to managers in the first instance. I didn't feel like I could go higher than them because they had close relationships with the SMT, as I've said, and like the rest of my colleagues at Brook House, I had absolutely no confidence in raising concerns internally at Brook House. So, I mean, what my question would be: what use would it have been to have raised a complaint or a concern? How would I ever substantiated the complaint, given that there are no cameras inside the cells, and given the hostility towards raising complaints, given that these were managers with close relationships to SMT? I mean, it's just
All right.
it's completely, it's ridiculous to actually, when you factor everything in, to suggest that I was in a position to raise concerns and have them believed or listened to. It's just, of course, we know that now because of Nathan Ward's account of when he actually did raise concerns, and I've spoken about when another colleague raised concerns yesterday. So I won't just repeat things I've already said, but you couldn't raise concerns at Brook House about the treatment of detainees. It just wasn't, or you couldn't do it effectively. It just wasn't possible, and I was not willing to raise a concern only for it to be disbelieved or discredited. That would have just made me more frustrated and angry.
Let's move on then. Mr. Tully, what I'm going to try and do is take the incidents in chronological order. And what I want to ask you now is about something entirely different. It relates to somebody called Calvin Sanders. And what you deal with is certain things that he said to you on two occasions, on the 4th of May and the 8th of May of 2017, but it appears in relation to something that may have taken place on the 24th of April.
Yes, sir.
And let's remind ourselves, the 24th of April is the first day that you successfully filmed.
I think so, sir, yes.
It's what you told us, but and it's the day before the Pascali incident, of course, just
Yes, sir.
getting our,
That's right.
fixing our gaze on where we are in the scheme of things. The narrative that you give to this, you'll find in your witness statement to the inquiry from paragraph 197 to 198, but you noted this up in one of your notebooks. Let's just have a look, because that would be probably the first place you will have noted it, even if you filmed it. So let's just have a look, please, at section A of our file, Chair. So for you, it's A4, so flag 4 behind section A. And if we can put up on screen, please, BBC 000059. To begin with, at page 3. And you can see here that towards the bottom of the page it says reporting shift 4th of May.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Now, if we can go to the next page. And bearing in mind you're dealing with the 4th of May, and we'll come back to this, but do you see where we have the first label for D1527?
Yes, sir.
It reads, in the afternoon, D1527 jumped on the D-wing netting. Yeah? And we'll
Yes,
come
sir.
back to that incident a little later. Jumped on the netting, said, and help us with it, it may need zooming in, please. Said to something. Can you read that? Under the D
Yeah.
of the first label, said to
In the afternoon,
something.
D1527 jumped on the D-wing netting, said to
To have been, to have been.
have been
By one officer.
yes, because he wasn't given a new
Plate.
and
And
had to use his own one.
He was threatening to dive off the netting and down the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
And then you deal with Clayton Fraser, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And what he said to you, and we'll come back to that. So here's the context. You're dealing with the netting incident involving D1527 on the 4th of May. And then at the bottom of the page, while waiting for the escort, now I think this is a different episode. You haven't put spaces between the various paragraphs as you sometimes do. But here you say, while waiting for the escort, I asked a DCO called Aaron, is that right?
Aaron, sir.
Aaron, and that's Aaron Stokes.
Yes, sir.
And you put this in quote marks, I think. What's the best way to deal with someone like D1527?
Yes, sir.
And Aaron said, look away and hope he's swinging when you look back.
Yes, sir.
So there's just still putting this in context. Another DCO, and this is where we now come putting the whole thing in context, to Calvin Sanders. He said, and just read that to us, please.
Another DCO, Calvin Sanders, then said how he bashed Detainees' head on a table.
And so that the impression we get is you've got the incident on the netting with 1527. If this is right, at some point later that same day, on the 4th of May,
Yes, sir.
you're involved in an escort with Stokes and Sanders.
Yes, sir.
You say to Stokes, what's the best way to deal with somebody like that, by reference to 1527? Is that an example of one of your open questions?
Yes, sir.
He gives the answer he gives, and Calvin Sanders, who is also involved in the same escort with the two of you later that day, says what he says about how he bashed a detainee's head on a table.
Yes, sir.
Right so far?
Correct.
In the same diary, at page 8, we'll see that it's the reporting shift of the 8th of May. And at the foot of that page, if we can just zoom in on that, please. In the afternoon in or on in C Wing office, Calvin Sanders again told me how he smashed a detainee's head on a table.
Yes, sir.
He confirmed this was D1527.
Yes,
Is
sir.
that right?
That's correct, sir, yes.
And if we just go on, because you continue writing, a female member of staff, and how does that read? I just want to see if it's relevant to what
Then
you...
told me how short-staffed the centre was while she was working on nights. She said she had been stuck on a constant supervision for 4 hours and that wings were left totally unattended.
Right. Did that have anything to do with what
No, sir.
Sanders had just told you? So it's
No,
a
sir.
different conversation.
Yes, sir.
Right. So that's how you noted on 2 different occasions something Calvin Sanders had told you. If we go back to something I introduced a little earlier, your Sussex Police witness statement, which is at flag 1 of tab A, SXP 000120. Can we put that up, please, at page 7? And if we can zoom in on the second half of the page, beginning Thursday, the 4th of May. Because there you repeat, in effect, what we saw in the notebook about D1527 being on the netting, a conversation that you had with Clayton Fraser, to which we will return. And you see the next paragraph. Later the same day, I was on escort duty with DCO Aaron Stokes and DCO Calvin Sanders. Whilst we were all together, Calvin suggested that he slammed D1527's head on the desk and bent his fingers back. So that's the 4th of May.
Yes, sir.
Yeah? During this conversation, I asked Aaron what was the best way to deal with someone like D1527. Aaron replied saying, turn away, and hopefully he's swinging. I took this to mean that he wished for D1527 to hang himself. Now, let me ask you this, Mr. Tully. In your notebook regarding the 4th of May, did you see that there's a difference between what you said in your notes and what you say here in the Sussex Police statement, which, let me remind you, is dated the 23rd of November? In the note of the 4th of May, you say Sanders then said how he bashed a detainee's head on a table. And unless I have missed it, I don't see anything in your note about bending fingers back. But you attribute to him for the 4th of May also telling you that he bent the detained man's fingers back as well as bashing his head, not on a table, but you refer to a desk. Now, this is not me challenging you. I'm simply asking you how your note or your memory of what happened on what you were told on the 4th of May has changed between the note and your witness statement.
It's a reflection of what I understood him to be talking about with reference to the same day, same incident.
Yeah.
It's possible that I got the 2 conversations confused
Yeah.
and a bit mixed up, but I mean they were both recorded and on camera, so there's no doubt that they happened. I know you're not suggesting there is, but the reason why that's somewhat irrelevant is because they're talking about the same instance. So.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. I'm just trying to understand why there was more detail in the witness statement. Had you looked at the footage before you made the witness statement?
I'd watched the footage many times after filming it, but of course the contemporaneous notes were made immediately after the shift before I'd reviewed any footage, which may explain why there is a slight difference between them.
Yeah. Because when we look at what you say here for the 8th of May, there's also more detail than there was in your notes, which merely said or attributed to Calvin Sanders that he smashed a detainee's head on a table, confirming it was D1527. Here in your witness statement, made months later, and presumably in between times you'd had plenty of opportunity to see what he had said. On Monday the 8th of May, whilst on duty, I walked into the office of C Wing, where a female DCO, whose name I don't know, and DCO Calvin Sanders were. I said, I was with your mate the other day, referring to D1527. And when you say, I was with your mate, was that a reference to the 25th of April incident or something else?
I can't remember, sir. I think so.
I was with your mate the other day, referring to D1527. Calvin then said, I went out of the room to make sure no one was watching. When he was banging his head on the table, on the bounce, I went, and you say he then demonstrated banging D1527's head on the table with his hand.
Yes, sir.
And what I'd like you to do is demonstrate for us what he showed you. So you using your hand, you show us what he did with his. Once or more than once?
Once, sir.
And you say at this point he paused and said he locked his hand or arm to stop him from doing it. And show us what that means. What does that mean? At this point he paused and said he locked his hand or arm to stop him from doing it. What does that mean?
I think he was suggesting he kind of took control of his arm to stop him from self-harming.
Right. He then demonstrated twisting D1527's fingers. Calvin went on to say if you are self-harming, you're an attention-seeking little prick, or similar. It was as though he was bragging about what he had done to him. Now, what I would like then first to do, please, in terms of documents, because we're not going to look at footage, although we may look at a transcript of something else that you've said. But I want to look at a document first of all, and Chair, should be in your second volume at B4.
Thank you.
And I'd like to put up, please, on screen CJS 001085. And this is an ongoing record, and I want to ask you about it. We'll look at some entries. Right, can we just expand this at the top, and we will go through several entries, so we'll have to do this repeatedly. It calls itself an ongoing record. What would you know this form as, this kind of form?
It looks like a constant supervision form, sir.
So would this be part of an ACDT record?
Yes, sir.
And would it typically be the sort of thing that would be completed when a detained man was in the observation cells in 7 or 8 of the care and separation unit?
Yes, sir.
And we can see the date, it's the 24th of April. And the first entry made by a DCO at 5 o'clock in the morning is sleeping, movement noted. And so this will give us a sort of idea of the kind of observations that were made.
Yes, sir.
At 5:30, laying on his bed, appears asleep. 6 o'clock, lying on his right side, duvet on the floor. 6:30, asleep, lying on his back. 7, asleep, moved on to his right side. 7:29, asleep on his left side, duvet now probably on him is what it should read. Is that the kind of minutiae and granular detail which was expected if somebody was on constant supervision? So every movement.
Yes, sir. I mean, whoever's making these observations, DCO Shad's not making many, but I think that's just because the detainee is asleep, so there's not as many movements during the hours of the day when the detainee's awake and moving about.
Yeah.
You'd probably be making them more frequently, sir.
And then we have a handover. Can we just expand that typed entry, please, which looks like a stamped entry? Yep. Handover. Oncoming staff have been shown to the whereabouts of the detainee at risk, satisfied themselves that they are breathing, that they are the correct detainee as per the ACDT document. What's the ACDT document? What does that mean?
That's the form I was referring to.
The form
earlier.
you're referring to. Oncoming staff have been briefed on the frequency of conversations and observations required for this detainee, how the detainee is coping, care map and triggers have been explained, and the ACDT plan handed over. So this seems to be a formal, rather formulaic handover, which, am I right in thinking this is just a rubber stamping literally on this document at that point in time?
Yes, sir.
And it's dated, we can see, that same date, the 24th of April. It's timed at 5 to 8 that morning. And you have the signature, although we don't see who it is, of the briefing staff member and the signature of the oncoming staff member. So if this system of handovers was working as it should, the briefing staff member would be the one who'd just been on observations and was coming off and was literally handing over the observations of that detained man to the oncoming staff member.
Yes, sir.
Both of whom sign that the handover has been properly conducted.
Yes, sir.
Were you yourself ever engaged in handovers like this?
These handovers often occurred sort of at the end of a night shift when new staff have come on into a morning shift. So very rarely, sir. Occasionally. But usually the handovers were, or not usually, but often the handovers were less formal.
Well, that was my next question. I mean, this looks like a lot of information has been imparted, as it should be, and has been received and understood by the person who's coming on duty.
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, or even in your limited experience, of a handover of this nature, was it carried out as this stamp suggests it ought to have been?
Sometimes, but in my limited experience, often wasn't the case.
And so we can see, thank you, if you can take that off, and then we look at the next entry. At the bottom half of this particular page, we can see the handwriting changes. It's at 8:15, seen. Something complete is complete physical health. Checks which he declined, it seems to read. And then again, we have another series of entries. Lying in bed on right side, movement, and so on.
Yes, sir.
So that's the early hours into the morning of the 24th of April. Can we go to the next page, please? And if we look at the fifth entry down, the one at 12:40 at the top. And I'm just taking us through because it's the first time we've seen a form like this, and so it's a good example of this kind of constant supervision and the entries made. That's at 12:40, still laying in bed, refused lunch. So there's a lunch refusal, and it's noted in this document. Would it also have been noted in the usual monitoring form for food refusals, or was that unnecessary in this kind of instance?
It should have been, sir.
And then at the foot of that page, we're in the early afternoon. Can we go up? No, to 15. No, please. The bottom half. of 1515 and onwards. This tells us that this was the monitoring of D1527, because we can see his cipher appear at 1504. He's now up and playing on the pool table with other detainees, so he's out of his cell, and he is playing pool. Now let's just understand this. He was on constant supervision.
Yes, sir.
Was he, therefore, from your looking at this form, so that I haven't got it wrong, was he, or would he have been on constant supervision in the care and separation unit or the main part of E-wing?
The main part of E-wing, sir.
Right. So he wouldn't be in one of those observation cells with the big viewing panel, or would he be?
He could have been. I don't think he was on this day.
Yeah.
But if you were in one of those cells with, regardless of what cell you're on an E-wing, you didn't have to stay in your cell.
see.
So during association times, even if you were in one of the cells with the big windows on, you could still leave your cell.
Now, let me just understand this, because it's easy for us to be confused, and it's even simpler for me to confuse everybody else. Cells 7 and 8,
Yes, sir.
were they in the main part of E-wing or the care and separation unit?
The main part of E-wing.
Right. And they were the one with the big viewing panels?
Yes, sir.
Right, okay.
At either end of the wing.
And then we have at 1515, after completing D1527's review and informing him that he won't be returning to his old room, due to his low mood and demeanour, D1527 began to throw his chair around his room in anger. D1527's chair has now been removed from his room, and he will remain in Eden Wing until he is reviewed again tomorrow. And we can see who signed that one off. That's Nathan Ring. Yeah? Can you see DMN Ring?
Yes,
At the end of that.
Just about, sir, yes.
Well, not his signature, but you can see DM or DCM N Ring.
I think so, sir.
And then at 1520, D1527 was under his cover, attempting to, what it reads, it looks like attempting to ligature around his neck.
Yes, it looks like that, sir.
Myself and DCM Michelle Brown, with the help of Oscar 1 Nathan Ring, we removed the ligature. So that's at 1527 on the 24th of April. And then to the next page, please. At the top of the page, I think it's 1532, it could be 37, refused to engage with healthcare, verbalised that he didn't want physical observations to be undertaken. And we can see that's an HCA. Is that a healthcare assistant? What does that refer to?
Not sure, sir, I'm sorry. Probably, though.
1540, officer trying to talk to D1527 about how he's feeling, trying to get him to change rooms. And then this, at 24, forgive me, same day, at 1540, and this is why I've gone through it a bit, we see DCO Calvin Sanders has now come on duty, and now he's going to do the constant supervision. And let's just look at his observations, because we will find that he was engaged in supervising D1527 on E-Wing for 2 hours. 1540, DCO Calvin Sanders doing constant for observations on D1527, appears to be lying on his front with his head buried in his arms. 10 minutes later, 1550, still laying on his front, appears to be crying. Ask him what was wrong, no response. 1552, D1527 was banging his head on the base of his bed repeatedly. I went in to prevent him doing any further damage. All right?
Yep. Sir.
1603 is trying to drive his index either side of his neck with extreme pressure. I've asked him to stop, or I will place my hands on his hands to pull them away to prevent him injuring himself. 1616 keeps banging his head on the base of his bed. I'm trying to talk him out of it and to sit up and talk to me so I can try and help. 1635, continues to cry with his head on the base of the bed. 1647, has engaged in conversation and is now talking to me, wishes to go to the mosque. 1705, operations manager Kaz Dance Jones has come into his room to see what's wrong. Pausing there, what level within the G4S structure was Kaz Dance Jones?
I think she was a member of the SMT, sir.
And then top of next page, please. 1715, DCM Stuart Povey. He's the chap you spoke about yesterday who you respected.
Yes, sir.
DCM Stuart Povey came to speak to 1527 as he wishes to move back to C Wing. And then 1734 appears to be calm now and is engaging in more depth conversation. And finally, I think as far as Sanders is concerned, 1742, have tried persuading 1527 to eat, but says he won't eat. Unless he goes back to C Wing, then he will eat. And just because we have it open now, can we go to page 7? Because these observations continue, and right at the bottom, they go from just before midnight on the 24th of April into the early hours of the 25th. Second entry up from the bottom, we can see 3 minutes past midnight. And this goes on for several pages, and I'm just going to show this now, please. Obviously we'll come back to it. Can we go to page 17, please? And right at the top, if we can expand the top half, please. We'll see the entry on the 25th of April at 1 minute past 7. D1527, kicking and banging door, and it's signed off by Fraser. And then at 1940, so 39 minutes later, seen in room 7, constant watch. Now, room 7, is that the observation cell? Number 7, with the big viewing panel, not in care and separation, but in the main part of E-Wing.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Constant watch. D1527 tied a T-shirt around his neck, angry, upset, had mobile phone battery in his mouth, attempted to self-strangulate, could be in bed, not sure. Usual observations, only due to demeanour. And it's signed off, hard to tell what that means. Have you got any idea? It looks like RESP, RESP 16. Does that mean anything to you?
It doesn't, sir.
No, self-strangulated in toilet. I can read it better on the screen than I can on paper.
It,
self-strangulated in toilet, usual observations, only due to demeanour, RESP 16.
Only due. Yes, sir. I'm not exactly. I can't be certain who wrote that, but and we'll see later on in the undercover footage that this sounds like what the nurse reads out to me. Something similar to what the nurse reads out to me after the choke. I don't know if this is what she's reading, but it's something similar.
Mr. Ottman, I believe it says visual observations only, rather than usual.
You may be right. I'm sure you're right. Yeah,
Sorry to be a
visual
pain, sir, but
observations.
please could I quickly go to the toilet? I'm sorry.
No, of course you can.
Thank you.
Okay.
I won't be a
Shall we-
second. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologise. You go. And are you happy if we
I'm
just
not
sit
desperate.
here?
I can wait for us to stand, or
No,
I
no,
can.
no.
I can,
Are you happy for us to sit rather
Yeah,
than?
yeah, sure,
All right,
yes,
go on,
yes.
off you.
Sorry, guys.
No,
Sorry,
thank
Chair.
you. Right, can we put up on screen Mr. Tully's police statement, SXP 000120 at page 7. And if we can just expand the top half, please. You say on Monday the 24th of April, I was working my normal 13-hour shift as sports officer, which gave me free range of all the wings within Brook House. At some point during this shift, I walked into E-Wing and went to room 1, where I saw 1527 lying face down on his bed, motionless. In the room with him was DCO Calvin Sanders, who was sat on the desk between the two beds. I said to Calvin, "What's wrong with him? What's he doing?" Calvin said, "Keeps digging his fingers into his neck." I can't remember what else was said apart from Calvin saying he would get through to him eventually. I didn't really take any notice of this remark and left the room. I can't recall if I actually spoke to 1527, but I know he was lying face down on his bed, motionless. Now, did there come a point in time where you put 2 and 2 together? Because, of course, the one thing you wouldn't have had access to, I assume, is the ongoing record of observations that we have gone through together. But what you did have were 2 conversations with Calvin Sanders in particular on the 4th and the 8th of May, noted originally that he had banged the detainee's head, added to in your police statement that he'd also bent his fingers back.
Yes, sir.
And when did you put 2 and 2 together? Do you think that he must have been talking about this particular occasion, the 24th of April, when he was with 1527 on constant supervision on E-Wing?
I don't know the exact time, sometime after the conversation in early May.
All right, well, let's have a look at, as I said I might, let's go to a transcript of a video diary you made on the 13th of May. And so if we get our bearings, it's within a week after the second of the conversations you had with Calvin Sanders. It's B2 for you, Chair, and it's TRN 000047 at page 31. And can you see there, this is the 13th of May, although the date doesn't show on these video diaries, but it's the 13th of May. It's the same day as an incident will come to the attempted suicide by D628. And as I say, it's within a week of the second of the 2 conversations you had with Sanders. And you say at the top, so on 2 occasions now I filmed, what the fuck's his name? Says the producer, or whoever's speaking to you, Calvin. You say on 2 occasions now I filmed Calvin talking about assaulting this Egyptian detainee. It's just occurred to me that I was there on that day filming him when he says he was in the room, sat on the desk with this detainee. It was at that time, it was on that day that he smashed his head against the table. I had no idea what was going on in that room. To me, it was just an officer inside the room with someone who was on constant supervision, perhaps offering some advice or support. But as we've heard, Calvin was smashing his head on a table, and you're reminded while twisting his hand, you say, yeah. So that's the 13th of May, and how, as it were, you put 2 and 2 together. So that we're clear, the chronology is you actually see Calvin Sanders on constant supervision on E-Wing on the 24th of April, which
Yes,
happens also to be the first day of successful filming.
Yes, sir.
Just so there's no confusion, was he sitting outside the cell or was he inside with him? What would be the norm?
He was inside the cell with him. But
Would that be normal?
Normally you would sit outside the cell door, so you were visible.
Yeah. Visible to
the security cameras and other people on the wing.
what reason could there be for him going inside the cell to conduct constant supervision?
Sorry, I'm almost about to sneeze. Sorry, sir. To prevent him from self-harming, sir, or something more sinister.
On the day that you actually therefore see him, was there anything that said to you, something's been going on here? In other words, because the impression that you give in your
Yes.
witness statement to the police, the one that I've just read out to you, is that he was being helpful and offering advice and support to 1527 while he was observing him.
Well, at the time, I had no reason to believe that that wasn't the case, but on
Yeah.
reflection, given what Saunders later told me, and given the fact he was sitting inside the cell, and yet the detainee was lying motionless on the bed,
Yeah.
and was clearly not trying to self-harm.
I mean, you
It almost seems obvious that something untoward was going on. I mean, it clearly was when given the admission that Saunders later made.
well, let's think about this. I just want to test this just a bit.
Sure.
All right. When you saw Calvin Sanders on constant supervision, how long were you with him? I mean, we know from the observation log that he was with him for 2 hours. But presumably you weren't
No, sir.
watching him for 2 hours, more likely 2 minutes, I would have thought.
Yes, sir.
Right. So to be fair,
Yes.
you were there for a microcosm
Yes,
of the
sir.
time in relation to the 2 hours that he was on constant supervision of him.
Yes, sir.
But during the occasion where you came across him on
Yes.
constant supervision of 1527 on the 24th of April, nothing untoward was going on.
No, sir.
Nor was he bragging that anything untoward had happened.
No, sir.
And the first time he mentions doing anything untoward to a particular detainee without saying who it was or when it was on the 4th of May.
Yes, sir.
When all he said to you, it's not quite right, when all you noted about it at the time was that he had banged his head on a table, right? 4 days later, on the 8th of May, you get a little more information, at least as far as you've noted it down, that the man he's talking about is in fact D1527.
Yes, sir.
Yeah? But you say, in actual fact, it goes far further because it wasn't just a question of repeatedly banging his head on a table, it was also bending his fingers back.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Now, I have to ask you this, and I probably will ask you this kind of question more than once in relation to certain types of things that you've been told, but on the 4th and the 8th of May, when he told you what he did, about what he was saying he had done, as it turns out, to 1527, some days before on the 24th of April, did you believe him?
It's hard to remember at the time if I believed him or not.
Well, you probably knew the man. You knew Calvin Sanders. You worked with him.
He was a very new officer, sir.
He was
He was a very new officer.
at this time.
Yes, sir.
Right. So bearing all of that in mind, bearing in mind that you'd seen him, albeit for a couple of minutes at best, on the 24th of April, bearing in mind that what he told you on the 4th of May was in the company of Aaron Stokes, bearing in mind what he told you on the 8th of May, a few days later, when I said, on the 8th of May, a few days later, confirming it was 1527, I think when you were in the company of a female officer on that occasion.
Yes, sir.
Did you think this is a newbie who's just bragging and it's bravado, or did you think at that time that actually this really must have happened? And let me throw one other thing in the pot for you to think about now, and it may be nitpicking or splitting hairs, but the observations, if that's all we had, everything looks perfectly fine, that he was a caring officer, there to help D1527, if that's all you had, then looking at it, it all looks fine and dandy, and that everything he had done was perfectly good. Do you agree with that?
So it wasn't all I had because he had told me he'd
No, I
assaulted
said,
the
but
detainee.
my question is based on if that's all you had. On the face of it, superficially, the observations say that everything is fine.
Also, an officer would never write in the Constance Obs
No,
that
no,
he had abused the detainee.
I understand. But there's another feature which I just want to ask you about, and that's why I'm talking about splitting hairs. What he says is that D1527 was repeatedly banging his head on the base of a bed. The information he gave you was that he was banging his head on a table, he being Sanders. Now, some may say, well, what's the difference? Well, if one were examining these facts, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between the base of a bed and a table. My first question is, was there a table in that room for him to bang his head on, or a
Yes.
desk?
Yes, sir.
There was. Did you query any of that with him? Did you question him or challenge him about what he was telling you?
I was secretly filming at the time, so I was asking him
Yeah.
about it, trying to get as much information as I could about the
Yeah.
incident.
But bearing everything in mind, and bearing particularly in mind that this was, as you tell us, a new officer, and looking back, do you think it happened? It might have happened, or it could just have been bravado.
Looking back, I think it did happen.
Right.
At the time, did I believe him? It's hard to remember exactly how I felt at the time. I mean, yeah, you're thinking about so many things while you're secretly filming. You know, the main one being not being caught. So, and asking the right questions and conducting yourself in the right way. You know, you're not kind of thinking in the moment
Yeah.
how credible someone's claims are. So it's possible it was bravado, but the reason I think it happened, and
Yeah.
the reason I probably believed him at the time, was because of the demonstration that he showed me.
Yeah. Did he demonstrate the finger bending as well as the head banging?
Yes, sir.
And
this is
what
on the
did he
secret,
show you?
This is on the secret recording. Just that he bent his fingers back.
Yeah.
So he kind of demonstrated to me, and it seemed credible.
Yeah.
And he said it twice, sir.
Yeah.
Told me the same story twice, and
No,
they
I
didn't
know.
contradict one another.
And if he had done it, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how hard he'd done it, but there was a risk that there'd be injuries on 1527's head,
Yes, sir.
which somebody else could have noticed and reported.
Yes, sir.
And what might have happened in that situation? If somebody had said, you know, there are unaccounted for injuries which the observation logs don't account for, what might have happened in that situation?
I assume Sanders would have said, as I've said in the I've written in the constant supervision logs, that he was banging his head on
Yeah.
the base of the bed or whatever it was.
Yeah.
This is where he sustained his injuries.
So we could look at it this way, that if what Sanders told you on the 4th and the 8th of May about the head banging was accurate, then there is a possibility that what he had written up in the ongoing record about the detained man himself banging his head on the base of a bed was false.
Of course, sir.
Right. Well, that's all I'm going to ask you about that. Chair, I'm now coming to the 25th of April, and I would likely start by asking Mr. Tully for a narrative just to set up the playing of the video. I can start that now or start afresh at 2 o'clock. I'm entirely in your hands, or we could break now and come back a little earlier.
Why don't we break now and come back at 10 to 2?
Very well.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.